Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Meg King, Director of the Science and Technology Innovation Program. We are thrilled to expand our partnership with the Aerospace Corporation on space policy. Today's event follows an oversubscribed private session we held with Aerospace for congressional staff as part of our Technology Lab series on cyber threats in space earlier this year. The response was overwhelming with requests from the Hill, the executive branch, industry, and the press to make a session available to the public. So we listened, and we're so glad we did. This conversation is part of the Science and Technology Innovation Program's project Across Kármán, providing context and resources to understand why space policy matters. As we prepare for launch, follow us at Wilson STIP, S-T-I-P, to get the latest updates on Twitter, and visit Across Kármán, K-A-R-M-A-N, .wilsoncenter.org. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jamie Marin, Vice President of Defense Systems Operations and Executive Director of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation, to provide more context on today's topic and to introduce our moderator. Dr. Marin.
Well, thanks very much, Megan. Welcome to everybody who's joining us for this important discussion today. The fact that we had, I think, over 900 people sign up to hear this talk speaks to the urgency and the significance of the topic. And Meg, we really appreciate the continued collaboration between the Wilson Center and Aerospace and our Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Look, most of you are probably here because you're interested in space, or you're interested in cybersecurity, or maybe both. Or maybe, I guess you could just be here because you bought a ticket on Richard Branson's next flight and you want to make sure you're not going to get hacked in the process. But at some risk of preaching to the choir, I think it's important to note that both US national security and our economic prosperity are dependent on space to a degree that most people just don't fully appreciate. At the dawn of the space age, there was just huge interest in space, but it took some time for that to really matter down on Earth. Today, there's enormous excitement around some really highly visible developments, but almost ironically, the most essential space-based services are often invisible to us as users, and at the same time, invaluable in our daily lives and in the functioning of our society. A few of my colleagues at Aerospace published a really nice paper a couple years ago that showed how from farming to banking to emergency services to timing signals we use to route information packets on the internet, space is really fully integrated into society, and it's becoming more so every day. That obviously means cybersecurity, our topic today for space systems, is of central importance to the United States. If you've even modestly been following the news, it's clear that adversaries, criminal adversaries, state-backed adversaries, a melange of both, are using cyber attacks that have really an increasing sophistication and are achieving a wider impact than they have before. There's no reason to believe that that trend's not going to continue. In the last half year or so, we've seen water treatment breaches, we've seen hospitals breached, we've seen major insurance companies breached, we've seen infrastructure pipeline that disrupted gas supplies throughout much of the eastern United States. These are real and appreciable human effects. And as Meg alluded to, we've had some past events between Aerospace and Wilson that have highlighted how space systems are vulnerable to these kinds of threats as well. So that leads me to what our team thinks is a really key question, and that's what needs to be done, both from a policy standpoint, but also at the technical level where the, if you will, metaphorical rubber meets the road, to protect our space systems from cyber attack. These are the kinds of complex technical problems that led the United States government to create my organization, Aerospace Corporation, as a nonprofit 60 years ago. It was that working of really hard problems at the dawn of the space age that necessitated this sort of independent technical advice to the government. And frankly, getting to work on these problems and helping this country keep our technological, our economic, and our security edge over potential adversaries is what helps us keep world-class technical staff working at a nonprofit, thanks to our panelists today for doing so. So we also are really going to be excited to bring in friends and colleagues from the Space ISAC, a group set up to help foster industrial collaboration on space cybersecurity. And I am super excited to let us get into these topics with our moderator today. And our moderator today is a longtime friend of mine and great colleague, Teresa Hitchens. So Teresa has spent more than 2 decades of her career researching, writing on space and cybersecurity issues. She's worked on multilateral issues, including 6 years in Geneva as the director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. She's been an academic at the Center for International Security Studies at Maryland, and she sort of started and is now returned to her roots in her career as a reporter, now working with Breaking Defense as their air warfare and their space reporter. And I've just always enjoyed her insights and was really glad that she agreed to help us by hosting this event. So thanks again, Meg, and your team for all the work from the Wilson Center to put this together, and to my colleagues who are joining us to provide expert advice, and especially to Teresa, who's going to help us all sound more coherent here than we actually are in everyday life. Teresa.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for such a kind introduction. I really appreciate it, and I am honored to be here to help guide this conversation today about a topic that I believe is critically important, and one that is perhaps not talked about enough, particularly in policy circles. So I congratulate the Wilson Center and the Aerospace Corporation for putting this event on. And we have a good amount of time, but I want to make sure that we are able to get to audience questions. So I'm going to launch right in and introduce this excellent panel we have today. So in no particular order, I'm just going to introduce them briefly. You can find their full bios up on the event website. First, we have Erin Miller, who's Executive Director of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the Space ISAC, and she's going to tell you when she first talks about what exactly the Space ISAC does. Thank you for being here, Erin. Next, we have Brandon Bailey, who's the Cybersecurity Senior Project Leader, Cyber Acquisition and Validation Department. He might explain a little bit about what that means too, at the Aerospace Corporation. We also have Ryan Spielman, Principal Director, Cybersecurity Subdivision at Aerospace. And last and certainly not least, Prashant Doshi, Associate Principal Director, Cybersecurity Subdivision, also at Aerospace. And with that, we're going to move into the discussion. So how this is going to go, for those who are listening, is that I'm going to ask some upfront questions and kind of guide a conversation, hopefully informal. And then we will move on down the road to questions that have been sent by the audience. If you haven't sent a question in already, there is still an opportunity live to send a couple questions in if you so wish. So Jamie did an excellent kind of intro to why this is important and an important topic to look at, especially because it's been, as I noted, an under discussed topic in a lot of ways. And one of the key questions that kind of pops up right from the get-go is, given the importance of space systems, both to our economy and our society, but also to our military, should space systems be designated or considered critical infrastructure from a cyber viewpoint by the US government? And what would it mean if space systems were declared critical infrastructure? Because that is a term of art and it means something. Would this be a good idea? Why might we want to do it, and why not? And I'm going to throw this question to Erin, since that is sort of at the nexus of what she's working on. I will just say as an aside, normally the ISACs are created around critical infrastructure, at least they have in the past. So Erin, do you want to kick us off with that discussion?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Teresa. And thank you just upfront to the Wilson Center for putting on this event. This is a very timely discussion and very important that we have it. Thank you, Dr. Marin, for your comments, and thanks, Teresa, for your moderation. So I am the executive director of the Space ISAC, Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. My team does work with the global space community on a daily basis, and we are working to increase trust and access to information on cyber threats and vulnerabilities and improve resilience across the space industry. So we do recognize space systems as critical infrastructure. And as you very aptly pointed out, a lot of ISACs are based on the foundation and the roots of PPD 21 and the designations of critical infrastructures. There's 17 of them that exist today. So in the space, with regard to the space industry, it's not designated as a critical infrastructure, but we all know there are significant milestones that are occurring in the space industry right now. Lots of really great examples have been mentioned so far. Adoption of scalable models like ground stations in the cloud. We just brought Microsoft Corporation onto the board of directors for the Space ISAC to represent in that area. We also have commercial deorbit services that are new and novel, new rocket technologies, and lots of new business space applications that are coming to life daily. So these new technology advancements are happening all over the globe, and they are represented in the membership of the Space ISAC. But I want to be very upfront with you all and be certain that even before Richard Branson traveled to space over this last weekend, space systems were and already are critical infrastructure. So we are now expanding our reliance on space systems by introducing this travel aspect. So we already have an Earthbound reliance on space systems, and we're building these new capabilities that are going to cause even more interconnectivity between our planet, our space assets, and locales like the moon or Mars. So with regard to our Earthbound reliance on space assets, I want to dig a little bit deeper on that one for you, because the reason why we do what we do in Space ISAC is that humanity is already dependent upon space systems, and space critical infrastructure is used for our food supply chain, emergency response, fire response, healthcare, communications, jobs. Morgan Stanley said that it's $1.7 trillion worth of our annual economy by 2040. So we've got a lot riding on our space systems, and it would really behoove us to take that seriously. So I want to get to your second question where you ask about what are the implications of declaring space critical infrastructure. So there are a couple of myths. I think the best way to approach that would be to address those. And that is that space being designated as critical infrastructure isn't really the right way to say it. It's really space systems being designated as critical infrastructure, because we're not talking about a location. We're not talking about the realm of space being designated as critical infrastructure. So just to be very forthright on that one, we want to think of it as space systems, because we have to protect all of the different elements of the space systems. And also the designation of space systems as critical infrastructure doesn't automatically trigger any type of regulation. And there are a series of events that will have to take place if this occurs. So if the Space Infrastructure Act that's been contemplated and already written and proposed by Congress, if that were to pass, then there are a series of events that would take place. And they are very well articulated in that draft legislation from what I've seen. So we would further enhance the collaboration across commercial, international defense, and IC companies that are IC meaning the intelligence community, and further engage that government collaboration that takes place, enabling the real-time sharing of actionable information. Also, what would happen is there would be a sector-specific agency that would be designated. So all of the 17 critical infrastructures already have a sector-specific agency, and that would be one of the things that takes place. So the issue is probably just getting there, because this is probably the hardest part, because it's not necessarily the degree to which we are dependent that makes the case. It's just the fact that we are dependent upon space systems. And we haven't done this very many times. The initial set is 16, so we've only added one more critical infrastructure since the initial set was created.
Okay.
So thanks, Teresa.
It's a little more complicated than you might think, huh? So, when you think about, though, when I think about attacks on satellites, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, it's generally actually not cyber that comes first to my mind. It's actually anti-satellite weapons, things that blow things up in space, and yet y'all seem to be kind of saying that. Cyber attacks on spacecraft might actually be more likely than other types of attack. And Ryan, might you talk to us a little bit about why that might be so? Because it's not the first thing that comes to your head.
Yeah, I think the the kinetic threats, the electronic warfare threats are some of them that come to mind first. So why would somebody pursue a cyber attack on a spacecraft? And I think there's a few reasons. The first one that comes to mind is it's a little harder to attribute, or at least rapidly attribute an attack. Certainly, if you fire a missile, we're going to figure out where that missile came from. Same with electronic warfare, we can figure out where those signals are coming from. Another attractive, unfortunately attractive vector for an adversary is potentially the cost. I don't want to downplay the potential cost of a sophisticated cyber attack, but at least for a basic cyber attack, could have relatively low cost. And with cost comes, another feature: the number of parties that could be involved. It could pull off at least a basic cyber attack. The number of parties that could pull off a simple cyber attack versus firing a missile at a satellite, or getting an equipment necessary to perform an electronic warfare type attack. It opens up a number of actors potentially. And then I think the biggest one of all, probably the most important one, at least the biggest concern to me, is the potential to attack multiple targets simultaneously. Cyber could be a scalable attack, and it may not be practical to fire hundreds of thousands of missiles at once, but it may be possible to, with a single attack, to affect multiple spacecraft.
Hey, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the multiple, the possibility of multiple attacks. That's interesting, and that's something new. Maybe something we want to get into a little down the road. I guess one of the other questions, though, is what are the actual implications of a successful cyber attack on satellite systems? I mean, what might it look like? How might we know about it? What might it be able to do? Again, you have a very clear picture in your head of an ASAT, exploding a satellite, blowing up a satellite, if you will, into small pieces, or even jamming, because jamming has happened a lot in warfare and also in civil society around the world. It's already happening in different places. But what might the implications be? What might it look like? Brandon, you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, so to me, it would depend on what the objectives of the adversary would be. And they could be range from disruption of the actual mission and being able to do whatever mission it has, some sort of collection or whatever. It could be also somewhat of a kinetic based, where you deorbit the satellite, right? Where you've initiated some sort of thruster command to make the asset deorbit or perform some sort of orbit correction maneuver when it wasn't scheduled to. So what we like to think about, which you'll see in this chart, is the level of adversary tiers, and there's multiple tiered systems. Multiple people have, it could be 1 to 3, it could be 1 to 5. This is a 1 to 7 scale overlaid with kind of a typical space to ground communication link. So it could be a lot of different things. So if you think about, maybe like Ryan said, your most basic attack, like mostly anybody could do, that would be like a tier 1 adversary script kiddie, right? They pull off some sort of script from GitHub and try to run some sort of basic cyber attack. And those will typically be the ones that would, could affect a ground system, because some of the ground systems, depending on the mission, could be, internet accessible or very poorly secured. Whereas maybe your most capable state actors may be wanting to do some sort of, rogue ground station where they have their own RF capability to be able to do command link intrusion from their own rogue ground station and communicate to your satellite. So that could have an effect. That's similar to what you were discussing with jamming, but this could also be, if you don't have properly authenticated and encrypted command links, they may be able to circumvent your command link for your spacecraft and control your vehicle. And then there could be items like, well, what about space-based external attacks? That would be more in line, like we're seeing, more and more adversaries putting their spacecraft in orbit, which are sometimes getting close to other assets, or they have communication ability to communicate signals, and those will be your higher state actors. So what the implications would be could be different based on the attack, because it could be if you did a supply chain attack, which is something I'm extremely worried about, especially as we commercialize space and start to build more and more commercialized components and taking off the shelf components. So before, where we had a boutique model where we would, one satellite for one purpose. Now, if we build 100 satellites and we do a supply chain intrusion and get into that supply chain and actually affect, one component that then propagates to 100 satellites, that's a magnitude of scale of difference on impact. So it kind of depends on what the objective of the adversary would be, but it could be anything from just temporary disruption to complete mission failure, in my opinion.
Okay, so it's actually a multifaceted threat with a wide range of potential outcomes or difficulties in responding to. But you mentioned something that was interesting, and it was about kind of building satellites and how that how building bespoke satellites can change how difficult it is for people to get in, and then move towards commercial satellites. Shouldn't we actually know how to make satellites highly secure? I mean, we've been building satellites for a long time, both for commercial purposes and for military purposes. And one would assume that there are already measures in place to prevent some of these simple attacks, like maybe the script kiddie kind of thing, right? Ryan, can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So it's true. We've been building satellites for a long time, and we have a lot of experience doing that. But I think the many years of experience has really led to highly effective fault management systems, because we're really, the issues we've seen are kind of random part failures and faults, single event upsets, and those are the primary onboard issues the industry's had to deal with, and therefore have experience fighting. In addition, spacecraft, at least the advanced spacecraft, typically have a very hard outer layer, which is the encryption authentication layer, which is by itself an excellent layer of defense and probably not realistically breakable today. But what I think our experience hasn't given us, or hasn't helped us out with, are how attacks would exploit vulnerabilities, which would enable an adversary to bypass the hard outer layer, how successful those attacks would be, and what defenders could do in response. And another really big one is we don't have a lot of experience, or at least the spacecraft operators who would really be your frontline cyber defenders, don't have a lot of experience with what the warnings of a cyber attack are, what the indications are, what they could do to mitigate it, and that's kind of a really big area that I think we've been doing this a long time, but we haven't been doing the really significant cyber defense for a long time, and I think that's a big distinction there.
Can just to keep you on the hook here for a little minute, you mentioned that the military satellites would be harder to get into. I mean, we do have national security satellites, not just DoD, but of course the National Reconnaissance Office and others, and NRO is a spy agency. One would hope that they have pretty serious security. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in how cybersecurity is being applied, maybe in the military, national security sector, and in the commercial sector, given that the national security side is looking to take advantage of the boom in the commercial sector by even maybe buying commercial services from satellites rather than buying new satellites themselves or building new satellites themselves. So could you talk a little bit about the difference there and what that means?
Yeah, is that a question for me?
Yeah, Ryan, could you address it, or
Sure.
would you
of course.
else? Yeah.
How about I start, and if other panel members want to jump in? I think it's a big deal, and I think I think the distinction is the security that's typically in a DoD or NRO mission versus maybe a commercial system, which doesn't have necessarily the same standards and same security requirements and therefore design. And it may be easy for DoD missions or the military to say, well, we don't care. But when we're buying a bunch of services and potentially bandwidth and other things from them, it becomes a really big deal. And I think Space Policy Directive 5 was put out and in large part try and help us bring the commercial systems up to more of a DoD standard. I wouldn't say it gets all the way there. And I think that's even a big part of what Aaron's trying to do with Space ISAC and try and have a bunch of organizations kind of coordinate and kind of share requirements, lessons learned, what realistic attack vectors look like, and all that stuff. And I think the Space ISAC plays a big role in that.
Does anyone?
I can add to what you're saying.
Great. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, one of the big reasons why when I talk about Space ISAC, I mentioned commercial, international, and defense and IC is because defense and IC, we know they have their own set of standards and regulations that they follow, sure. But now that there are lower barriers to entry to get into the space market, then we have this consideration where there are commercial companies and also what Ryan mentioned, that we have international companies that we partner with and collaborate with, and we are increasing our dependency upon those commercial companies. And so I'm not asking that we specifically regulate those companies. I'm asking that in the Space ISAC that we come together and we collaborate so that we're all aware of the standard, the baseline expectation for cybersecurity, and we have active information sharing. So we have actionable intelligence around the threats, like the new threats that are coming out every day, like related to ransomware. That's a newer type of attack that, I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's more recently been employed so frequently and hitting the news so frequently. So now, we need to be very concerned and aware of whether or not the space industry has visibility on these different types of attacks and that they're getting the information in a timely manner. It's going to the right people who can take action.
Aaron, speaking of sharing information, can Space ISAC share intelligence and threats actually while they're happening, like real time? And would that help if you could?
Well, yeah, well, real time is, of course, hard. Even the military tries really hard to get to real time, right? But that is the ultimate goal, yes. So Space ISAC will have a watch center that will open next year. And it is a global watch center. So we'll have companies from all over the world sharing information, as well as our government partners that are US government partners and international government partners. So near real-time sharing will occur in Space ISAC. Okay.
And you just mentioned kind of the technical issue of, being able to share in real time, and that's hard for everybody. Let's move a little bit into the technical end here. And one of the questions that comes again to my mind is why can't we just apply the techniques, the methodologies, the software that we use, the principles even that we use to protect things on Earth from cyber attack to satellites? Surely we have a lot of expertise on that on the ground, especially as attacks have become more and more prevalent. Prashant, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would. That's a really good question. And I would actually say that the principles we've developed over the years on how to secure ground systems, principles like zero trust, least privilege, and probably most importantly, defense in depth architectures. Those principles really do apply to space systems and satellites overall. The challenge we really run into is an implementation challenge. We can't take the software we run on our servers or our personal computers, antivirus or our firewalls that we have, and load that on board a satellite. I mean, that would be the wish, and that'd make life a lot easier. Unfortunately, satellites they present a unique challenge. Satellites have a limited amount of compute, a limited amount of storage, memory, and power on board. And once you launch it, that's what you get. You can't upgrade any of the hardware out there. And so you have to run the mission on the hardware that's already there. So there's not a lot of extra hardware left over to run McAfee or some other sort of antivirus. So that really runs into an implementation challenge where we have to, as a community, work on research and development and put investments in place that allow us to take those principles that we talked about, like zero trust, and how do we implement those sorts of principles technically on board different satellites that also will have different amounts of power on them. Bigger satellites will have a little bit more capability, and smaller satellites will have less capability. So how do we tune our implementations to securing from a cyber attack for each of the types of satellites that we have out there? And that's, I think, one of the big challenges that we're going to be looking at over the next 5-10 years to figure out what we can do to secure these satellites in all these different shapes and sizes that are coming.
And that is a really good question. What can we do to enhance the cybersecurity of space system, and why doing that space cybersecurity or satellite cybersecurity, if you will, is different from ground cyber? Brandon, let's turn to you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So on that front, I agree that the security principles, and I've maintained this, for years, the security principles that we have applied that are become tried and true are applicable to the space vehicle, but there is a swap consideration. So what I feel like there's
a what consideration?
A swap, size, weight, and power. Sorry.
Okay.
There's a swap consideration that we have to deal with because we have limited compute. We're running 300 megahertz processors on board a spacecraft where we're running gigahertz level items on the ground. So it's not translatable, but the security principles can apply. And what we need to do is investigate in maturing the TRL levels up and building defense in depth. So that the slide that was just up is important because we need to ensure that we have defenses at multiple layers. And the reason is because I personally think no defense is impenetrable, especially when you take into account insider threat, right? When you have a malicious insider, it is very difficult to counteract that. So what you need to do is build in these defenses and build in these protections. Like I'll take a good example. So in this slide, what we have here is we have the spacecraft software and a list of protections that may help you build secure software, and then we have items that are on the single board computer, the processor, that can help establish root of trust and least privilege and these zero trust principles. But then it's also surrounded by like an intrusion detection and intrusion prevention and fault management system. So for instance, if you were to get some sort of malware on the vehicle, right, through the spacecraft development process, and say an adversary has penetrated your test environment on the ground, or your development environment on the ground, and malware somehow gets uploaded to the vehicle. So in some architectures today, that would be game over. You would have the mission will be over. But if you apply these defense in depth principles, maybe you've established some sort of least privilege or bus segregation or some sort of zero trust within the architecture on the onboard computer. So that malware may not be able to propagate to do other bad things. And maybe it bypasses what segregation you have there, but now you have this intrusion detection prevention, recoverability and detection capability within your intrusion detection and fault management. So you kind of build those defenses in, kind of assuming, in the standard IT world, we've moved away from this focusing so much on preventative. We need to do preventative measures, but we also need to do detection and recoverability as well. So I think that's where we need to get to, is this integration of fault management and intrusion detection and response capabilities on board to be able to help do this recovery mechanisms on board. So that's kind of the point. So what we've seen in the past, what Orion alluded to, was a lot of our focus has been in the cryptography in the comms area around the encryption authentication on the command link. And maybe we've not done as good a job as we need to on the fault management on board related to security and segregation on the bus and secure software development lifecycle items on the software. So that's kind of the pitch, and the idea is don't be solely dependent upon one layer, and then build the defense in depth layers and segregation and root of trust and these principles that have been proven to be valuable on the ground, and translate those to a low size, weight, and power technology on board the vehicle.
So it's really about redundancy in your defenses, yes?
Yes, yeah, that's another way to look at it. Redundancy in your defenses,
right.
Defense in depth.
Okay. One of the ways that we figure out how vulnerable our systems are on the ground is through penetration testing. Ryan, do we do that on satellites? Can we do that on satellites?
Yeah, so we have there's a few tests that people have done, and but they're very reluctant to do them in large quantity for sort of obvious reasons. But go back to the initial question. I think penetration testing is absolutely critical to the security of an overall system. If we're not constantly attacking and finding holes and vulnerabilities in our own systems, our adversaries will do it for us. And I don't think you can ever say that your system is secure unless you're willing to try and break it yourself. And I know that, stepping back for a second, I know that concept is going to scare a lot of program managers and spacecraft operators, but keeping in mind, just because we're running a penetration test doesn't mean we need to do a thoughtless, rapid penetration test with potentially devastating consequences to a system that we can't walk over to like we could on an IT floor and reboot it. These systems are very expensive. So just because we're talking about a penetration test doesn't mean we can't add significant system engineering around the actual test itself to make sure that what we're about to do is reasonable, to make sure that we understand at each layer of the test what the possible consequences are, and we are prepared to prepared to halt the test or whatever we need to do. The other thing that I was mentioning a little bit earlier is, and Brandon mentioned this as well, a lot of it is, it's not just about stopping an attack or preventing it from entering the system to begin with. It's about detectability. How quick can you detect that it's going on? How can you recover? And as we run these tests, one of the outcomes of it is you're not just going to find the vulnerabilities. You're also going to train your spacecraft operators, who again are your frontline cyber defenders, whether they like it or not. You're going to train them to understand what an attack looks like, to be prepared to rebuild systems as necessary, to mitigate attacks, to understand what they can and can't do. And if we don't do all those things, then we're going to be sitting there with no experience in the no experience playing the game when the game actually starts, which is not a good thing.
You said that program managers and stuff are sometimes reluctant for obvious reasons, but they're not necessarily obvious to the audience. And one of the things that you made it sound in your answer sounded kind of like they're afraid you'll break it, and if it gets broken, they can't do anything about it because it's on orbit. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit, like what the fears are?
Yeah, and I think Brandon has his hand up. He probably wants to answer a little bit too, but I'll give the quick answer. So yeah, if my job is to be a program manager for a very expensive space system, then it's reasonable that I don't necessarily want to hire a red team to come in for a week and just start trying to break whatever they can break, which is oftentimes how a penetration test works. But I guess the main point is, it doesn't have to be a traditional pen test where we come in, we try and break stuff as fast as possible, we get out of there. We can pay a little bit more money, go a little bit slower, and kind of understand what the consequences are, so that program manager doesn't have to worry about losing their $1 billion asset.
Okay, Brandon?
Yeah, so this is where I'll get on a small soapbox and advocate for the digital twin technology that has evolved over the past 10 years and what you can do with it. It can be hugely beneficial in this arena. So, digital twin technology has evolved with instruction set simulation, with commercial solutions and open source solutions, where we can have super high fidelity models of the actual hardware of the spacecraft, and be able to do these legitimate penetration tests on the vehicle at the software level, at the single board computer, and those type of things. You won't necessarily do command link intrusion using RF using these, but you would be able to mimic supply chain attacks. You would be able to perform various software-based attacks and see how it propagates within the digital twin environment. And then if you can get buy-off from the program manager, and this is an actually on-orbit asset, maybe you try it out on the asset, you're comfortable with that and want to do that. Not sure you need to do that. If you have a digital twin of your spacecraft, you can do all these tests. So that's what I think what we need to get to is, as we are building these systems on the ground now, we develop these digital twins alongside with it so we can perform a lot of this security-based testing to alleviate some of the issues with potentially damaging the hardware for certain type of attacks. And then if we're comfortable with it and we want to actually see the ramifications on an actual flat sat or actual vehicle, then we can execute on the vehicle. But I think the utilization of digital twin technology, and I'm not talking about, model-based system engineering, digital twin, UML diagrams. I'm talking instruction set simulation type of activities where you can actually run software, you can run 1553 or CAN bus or whatever type of technology that you're using for your spacecraft and do the testing that way. So that's where I think we need to move towards, and that's what I want to push for in the future. But I think that's how we can have a good happy medium to keep program managers' risk down, but also do some of the security research and pen testing we need to do.
That's really fascinating,
And
especially.
I would,
I was just going to say, especially because that whole digital twin thing is something that the Space Force is really like leaning in on right now. There for a lot of different reasons, for a lot of different programs as well. I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to add that the digital twin concept is absolutely the right one, and that's our future, and it's going to require a lot of push from the policymakers and the government side and the acquisition side, such that it's almost required as we get satellites delivered and we create this robust digital twin environment where it's not just one satellite, it's almost our whole constellation is represented in these test beds that are available to red team operators and other people who are trying to do anomaly resolution, where we can really test stuff out in a safe way that we can't do. And the technology is getting there, and we have to be ready to take advantage of that technology. And that's something we really, as a community, need to come together and push for.
Yeah, one last point on that. So I think the digital twin transformation that we're going through right now, and where we see the future of space with perforated LEO and mega constellations, I don't know of another way how you're going to be able to mimic and test some of these concepts of crosslink and various levels of cyber attack without digital twins of these things, because you're not going to have 40 flat sats that you're going to be able to integrate and test these out. You're going to need 40 digital twins, which you can do with just compute resources.
I think it was Ryan who mentioned red teaming, or somebody did. And Prashant, do you think that the digital twin concept would make red teaming easier? Do we actually do red teaming now on cybersecurity for satellites?
There's not a lot of red teaming going on right now. As we discussed, going and doing a red team against an operational system, especially a really high value operational system. I mean, if we did a red team test against our early warning systems and something goes wrong, and now we don't have the early warning systems, that's not good. So we have to. That's where digital twins really can come in, where we can test these offline without affecting the mission in a negative way. So yeah, digital twins really seem like that is one way to go. And then, as Ryan said, being creative and smart about how we do some of the other tests, so that we can get some idea of what our systems are going to react to under threat, because it's going to be hard to have digital twins for our legacy systems currently. And so we are going to have to do some smart things against our current on-orbit system, the legacy systems, to understand how they could be attacked, so that we can prepare for the future.
Prashant, do you think that we need like better standards to do this, or how do we fix this? I mean, going forward, and I mean, this is a two-phase problem. You have the legacy systems, you have the systems that are in development. Do we need new regulations? Did we just need people to get together and build standards? Because it's not just sharing information. It sounds like there actually has to be some impetus for some of this to move forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. How do we move forward? We kind of identified some of the problems here. And so how do we move forward? So the simple solution, ideally, would be taking our terrestrial security standards and just directly applying them to spacecraft. But as we talked about, spacecraft are a little different. The implementations are a little different, and so that's going to be a little tricky because space systems are unique. But I think we should build on SPD5, and we should create policies and standards that go, a little lower level for spacecraft security. This will enable, commercial companies that want to do business with the government to meet some standards where the government will feel more secure working with those commercial companies. And then on the national security side, we'll need more specific security standards that are, should be tuned to the threat environment. I think one of the challenges is that if we don't want to just put a blanket set of requirements or standards out there without understanding what the threats are, what does that mission trying to achieve? We don't want to layer too much standards or too much security on a system that may not need it, which of course drives cost, which we don't want to drive extra costs for no reason. In an ideal situation, at least from the U.S. government perspective, we'd have some sort of standard for a cyber protected type of spacecraft, and that'd be a great place for us as a country to get toward.
I think SPD 5 has been mentioned a couple of times. Aaron, do you want to just give us an idea of actually what it says, what it does, and whether it's been effective or not up to now?
Yeah, so SPD 5, it has 5 principles in it, and it is a solid set of guidance for protection of space systems. From my perspective, we have an SPD 5 task force that comes together to meet regularly and talk about it in Space ISAC. And what we've discussed is that it is asking space system owners, manufacturers, operators, and to all design security into the space asset and start anticipating cyber attacks. So this is really a good tool for education. Something that has maybe been glossed over a tiny bit in this discussion is that designing cybersecurity in hasn't always been, an assumption, but it needs to become more of an assumption that we're going to do that, and also kind of the convergence of cybersecurity and space professions, because they haven't converged in all ways yet. We need to work to create educational opportunities so that we can have a convergence between space systems engineers and cybersecurity professionals. So SPD 5 recommends hardening platforms, creating cybersecurity plans, sharing of threats and vulnerabilities into an ISAC environment like the Space ISAC. It also recommends international and industry collaboration to create cyber resilience so that becomes the norm. And it really promotes awareness that the commercial sector and new space companies need to consider their systems vulnerable to attack, and that we have truly an extension of our terrestrial network into the space layer network that needs to be protected. So I would call it a follow-up perhaps to SPD 5 is the National Institute of Standards and Technology Interagency or Internal Report. That's the exact title, 8270. It's open for public comment right now, and it is narrowly focused only on crewless space vehicles that will not dock with human-occupied spacecraft. So I would highly recommend reading that if you're interested in more specific lexicon and direction around how to secure space platforms and assets.
Aaron, do you just want to talk about, are you seeing more interest from companies now in the Space ISAC and in kind of implementing SPD 5 or more or less? Is there more attention now since that SPD?
Well, what I would say is that a lot of the companies that are in Space ISAC were familiar with some of the terms and the direction that were in SPD 5, unless they are small, medium-sized companies. So that's really where we are putting our priority focus now in the Space ISAC, is understanding whether or not our small, medium-sized companies are implementing SPD 5 principles and where there might be a gap. And that's where we're going to be focused for this multi-decade effort, is the supply chain and our small, medium-sized companies, because you can have a large, robust effort underway in a large company to ensure that you're designing cybersecurity in, and if you're not sharing that with your supply chain, then you're introducing additional unnecessary risk.
Yeah, I would think so. I assume that this problem gets more complicated as you have more new entrants also into the space regime. As the SPD actually mentions new entrants, so it just kind of complicates the subject because you have different people with different levels of, I guess, experience, right? Aaron?
Perhaps, yeah, or different budgets, we could say, also to support it. Also different levels of awareness. So that's part of the information sharing activity, is creating that awareness and ensuring that new space companies that now know that they're vulnerable to attack, they have the mitigation measures available to them. And they have the access to the incidents of compromise on a near real-time basis, we'll call it.
I guess I have another question flowing from that. Just came into my head was, you mentioned that SPD5 has this international component and it has this sharing, information sharing component. But I have found, at least in research that I have done, and I did actually some research on this very thing for the University of Maryland a few years ago, that one of the key problems about sharing information has been there's a secrecy problem. And there's a classification problem when you get into national security. And maybe would someone like to just address that barrier to actually sharing, not only internally with industry, US industry and government, but especially when you talk about sharing with international partners or foreign companies or things like that. Anybody want to raise their hand on that?
Well, I can start, and then I'd like the other panelists to also add to what I have to say. Because initially, when Space ISAC was announced by the White House, then there was the declared need to share commercial and internationally. And the intent is for Space ISAC to share unclassified. And the reason why is because it's well understood now that space systems have vulnerabilities and there are risks that need to be managed, and you can apply those same concepts across different space systems. So you don't actually have to name the space system that is being identified. You don't have to identify it. We can separate the vulnerability from the name of the space system in order to keep it unclassified and still learn a lot from each other. And there's also been a lot of information. I'll reference the DIA report that got published in 2019. So the Defense Intelligence Agency, they published a report in 2019 that previously a lot of the information was classified. So there's an effort, a concerted effort towards making sure that information that doesn't need to be classified, that needs to be out there in the global space community, is reaching the global space community.
Great. Anybody else want to just address that quickly?
Yeah, I can start and let Brandon and Prashant fill in whatever's missing. Another aspect, people are always going to have these issues to sharing, right? Possibly giving out sensitive information or IP. Obviously, classification in our business is a big deal. But one of the things about sharing is to help somebody, you don't necessarily need to right away share everything you have. Just the fact that you believe something is going on and it affects this particular subsystem, and you don't necessarily have to say what it is, that can be really useful for a lot of people, right? Does it mean that I'm going to stop my mission? I certainly don't want to do that somewhere else, but maybe it means I delay a software upload I'm about to do. Maybe it means I call a few extra IT people and have them come in and look for potential vulnerabilities. So maybe I don't take an extreme countermeasure to a poorly defined piece of information, but maybe I take some basic measures, get some operators to pay attention, call some people back from lunch, whatever I can do that until I get more information. And then if you want to go through your security office and figure out whether you can share this because it's classified, or go through your corporate attorney and find out whether we're giving up IP by sharing something, then you can potentially share at a higher level. But just a little bit of information early on could help quite a bit.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I tend to work in the military arena where sharing tends to be, it's a big issue right now, over classification, particularly in space, and what do we do about that, and how do we resolve those issues? And speaking of the government and how they handle these issues, are there things that the government should be doing, can be doing now, or perhaps in the near term, to help commercial space firms actually improve their cybersecurity? Brandon, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah. So on the sharing note, that's not a space unique problem for cyber information sharing, cyber intelligence sharing. I mean, there's been several administrations. I think every administration, the last 3 administrations, have put out either executive orders or policy directives about sharing cyber intelligence and sharing cyber information. So I think sharing of information and educating on the threat may be beneficial. So I think being more, it used to be more of a, it was way more protected and quote secret, and no one really wanted to talk about it. But like Aaron said, with the DIA report and other reports from NASIC and other things, it's becoming more, people are becoming more educated on the actual threat. So I think education on the actual threat landscape is key. And I think aerospace we've been doing some good work on actually trying to educate people on the threat a little bit through some of our reports and things that we've been putting out. In addition to educating on the threat, educating on what to do about the threat. So that can come through standards development, like what Aaron's talking about, and that type of thing. I think if we were able to publicize what to do about the threat a little bit more, I think that would help commercial companies as well. And establishing standards is one way of doing it, or putting publications on the types of things. So SPD5 did a good job of giving you some very basic things that everyone should do, authentication, encryption, jamming, spoofing protection, insider threat, supply chain. So it gave you some concepts to worry about, but what do you actually do about it, right? And so getting from, yeah, there's a little bit of a problem, we need to worry about this, to here's some actionable information and actionable guidance to help mitigate the threat. I think that's where we need to move to. So taking it from, because what I've seen through articles or publications, you see cyber as a black box. So cyber is treated as this monolithic threat, and they say you got to worry about cyber, and then they don't tell you, well, what aspect of cyber do I need to worry about? My supply chain? Yeah, okay. Well, what do I do about it? Do I need to worry about encryption? Okay, I do. So what algorithms should I be using? Should I be kind of use triple DES, which no one would do, or do I need to use AES 256 or some sort of NSA type 1 application? So it's getting to that from, yes, there's a problem. So we're all on step one, right? We've identified there's a problem. We're kind of all agreeing that there's a problem. So now what do we do about it? So I think that's where we need to get to, and I'm hoping that's where we work with ISAC and other communities like that, of getting out published guidance on how to actually mitigate the threat. And it usually translates to requirements of some sort of, like, these are the technical controls and requirements that we need to actually implement to help mitigate the threat. So that's where I think we need to get to, and that's a big.
Does anyone else want to chime in quickly on the government issue, how government can help?
Yeah, so it's
I do.
Okay, Prashant, you go first. And
no, if you want to go, Aaron, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that what the government can do is designate space systems as critical infrastructure, because critical space systems, critical infrastructure owners and operators are uniquely positioned to manage risks to their individual operations and assets and determine effective strategies to make them more secure and resilient. So we need to empower them, those space system critical infrastructure owners and operators, and give them the information they need. The information needs to start flowing, and that is one of the byproducts of the designation of critical infrastructure as critical infrastructure.
Prashant?
And I was going to add on to that. It just goes back to something Aaron said earlier about how we have to start designing cybersecurity right from the beginning. We got thinking about cybersecurity. So I think that's between designating space as critical infrastructure, I think is one piece of it. As the government has to adopt a security mindset when it comes to designing and purchasing their space systems, that can then start influencing, the commercial companies that are building satellites to start, putting security into design. We all know they want to run fast and get something up and running, but trying to get that culture out there to think about security of those systems is something the government has to adopt itself, and then push that out to basically the rest of the community.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think I'm exhausted. Or my questions are exhausted. I'm going to flip over now to put forward some of the audience questions, and we have actually quite a few audience questions here. We have until 4:30. So I don't know that we're going to make it through all the audience questions. So if you're sitting out there listening for your question, if I don't get to it, I apologize in advance. Maybe you can, figure out how to contact our panelists afterwards. I'm sure they're all available to have chats with interested people on this issue as we go along. As a first question, I mean, it kind of bounces off what we were just talking about. An audience member has asked, is there a way for countries and individuals to kind of future-proof against cyber terrorism in and of itself? Erin, do you wanna address that one?
So when I hear the word cyber terrorism, then I think this is just another term for the massive number of cyber attacks that are hitting our systems daily already. Just depending on the different scale of attack, it may enter into the terrorism level. So what I would say we can do to future-proof in that direction is to keep having these types of discussions and stay focused on the task at hand. We need to be very deliberate and intentional in raising our global security posture and reach as many people that are starting space companies as possible so that we can start as early as possible. Also, it would help to have more principles, best practices published and established so that the global space community can operate as one instead of in disparate parts.
Actually, that kind of leads into the next question that someone has put forward, and that's about cooperative mechanisms amongst allies against cyber attacks. I know that there have been several groups of governmental experts at the UN level who've talked about cyber principles and cyber sharing and transparency and confidence building measure. But are there cooperative mechanisms, maybe a little more concrete than just saying, cyber attacks are bad, that allies could do, the US and its allies could do together? Erin, do you want to start with that? Is anybody else who wants to chime in?
There are a lot of initiatives underway. from the defense perspective, then there's the CMMC, which is Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is going to extend globally. There's also clearly the ISAC model, which extends globally. And there is a UN outer space group that meets regularly that maybe someone on the panel is more familiar with than I am. I haven't attended one of their meetings yet. There's also an initiative underway from DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and their cybersecurity infrastructure agency that collaborates with all ISACs. They have a group that is focused on space systems, critical infrastructure, and it is open to companies who are currently part of a designated critical infrastructure. So that is a larger public-private effort as well. Anyone else may want to add to that?
So I'm not much of an international expert, so I'll speak a little bit out of ignorance, but I have heard, so there's events, more recently, like the NATO Lock Shields event that had occurred that has a little bit of space to it. So there's some international collaboration with some of these red versus blue or international events that they can learn and share information and things like that. Now, I don't know much about Article 5 as it relates to NATO, but I believe something did change with Article 5 more recently about cyberspace and cyber attacks and invoking Article 5. I don't know, Teresa, you may be more educated on that than me. I've just saw some headlines on it. So I think, right now, if we can all come to an agreement globally that, cyber action and cyber attacks are maybe not an act of war, but getting close to an act of war, right? If we can come to agreement on those type of things, I think, it may be better suited or in a better place from that perspective. So I don't know, just throwing that out to the group and how that kind of relates. But some of those international events could be good, and coming to some agreement on what does a cyber attack mean and what should be the appropriate response. Because we're really good at, when when missiles are fired, what our responses should be, but we're not so good when cyber attacks happen. And then what would that even mean on a space asset? Does that get you over the hump of, okay, this is an active war because it was on a space asset? I'm not real sure. So those are some of the things I think about and would be interested to hear your opinions on.
Speaking about NATO Article 5, for those who don't know, Article 5 of the NATO Charter essentially says that attack on one is an attack on all, is treated as an attack on all. And yes, both in the space arena and in the cyber arena recently, NATO has declared that these are areas of operation, which means that Article 5 could be invoked if there's an attack. One of the, so in the cyber arena or in the space arena, but one of the problems is that there isn't really a NATO definition, there isn't a legal definition of what is a cyber attack. And that threshold could be different for different countries. And that's why that becomes quite complicated down the road from a military perspective in any event. So it is, but it is possible that NATO could band together to say, you know, there was this really terrible, horrible cyber attack, and we're now going to treat that as as an act of war against all of us, right? We have another audience question that goes to the vulnerabilities and asks about thoughts on the greatest vulnerabilities of space systems, given, you know, you have different segments. And should the focus be more on the ground segment or the space segment? In other words, which one has the most vulnerabilities? Ryan, I'm going to toss that to you.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I hesitate to answer the question directly. I guess the biggest vulnerability is the fact that there's such a large attack surface to begin with. I think that's, I know that's not a specific vulnerability, but the chart Brandon showed earlier about all the possible attack surfaces, I think is really kind of the key. There are lots of possible entrance points. And it may be tempting to try and find one or two obvious attack vectors and single it out, but I think that would be a mistake from a strategy standpoint. Now I'll still give my best answer to the question anyway because it was asked. But if I had to name a few obvious entrance points, I would say supply chain. I know Brandon mentioned that quite a bit earlier. Trusted insiders is another really obvious entrance point, and another one that I think about quite a bit that may not be quite as obvious is an air gapped ground system that isn't really air gapped. But again, I think it would be naive to say that those three are the only possible ones. Let's defend against those. I really think we need a more holistic answer. The part of the question about does space or ground have more entrance points? I really think we need to think of it as a single system, right? Yeah, of course you want to go after the entrance points. We want to defend against those as best we can. And frankly, it's probably the ground that has more entrance points. But a defense in depth model says we don't just defend at the entrance points. We defend throughout the system. We're detecting signs of attack. We are trying to slow the attack down. We have ways to recover and be resilient to attacks. And so I think from a defense in depth model, I think you really have to treat space and ground as one system, not independent systems.
Okay, Brendan has his hand up. Brendan?
Yeah, so I think this chart kind of captures it. So I agree with Ryan that it's be a little bit naive to because that's what we've been doing probably for the last 15, 20 years is focusing a lot of the attention on the ground. And my personal opinion on why we have focused that is because sort of this threat model, right? So the threat model is that the script kiddies can operate on the ground, and we feel like that's the most likely entry point for an adversary potentially. However, what I would say is from a national defense perspective, we're not going against script kiddies. So like, that's not necessarily what we're going after. We are going after more advanced adversaries that are probably going to do a little more sophisticated things. So if we focus all of our attention on trying to prevent some of the lower tiered actors and focus everything's like, okay, this is the most likely scenario because it has the largest attack surface, is a little bit misguided in my opinion, because if an adversary wants to take out a capability, they're going to probably come from a different angle. And supply chain probably being the most logical one from my perspective, like I said earlier, especially given if we're going to go to these commercialized components and large constellations, that's how you're going to have an effect on multiple assets. Is either you're not going to be in communication to all 150 satellites in your constellation at one point in time. It's going to be, but if you were able to compromise a hardware component or a software module through some process, then you can have an effect on lots of them. So that's kind of my interpretation. Is we focused a lot on the ground because we understand it more and it's more traditional and it has a large attack surface. But I think that's probably not our highest risk area. If I was playing devil's advocate and trying to figure out like how we would be attacked.
That goes to another question that from the audience that's a little more like honed in, and you mentioned, the commercial supply chain and reliance on commercial systems. Does the commercial satellite industry actually have the capability right now to adjust attacks like SolarWind, which was on a server, directly on servers?
So, well, SolarWinds is a little different. That's more of a exploitation of trust that occurred. So when you take, which would be similar to anything that we get, like if we would, if a vendor was to get software from one of their trusted suppliers and was infected, then it would propagate through the system. So our architectures and some of our designs currently aren't built with that zero trust model in mind. So they probably would not be able to detect or recover from some of those types of things potentially. But I think what SolarWinds does is open your eyes to the probability and likelihood that how could this affect me. So that's what people will look at SolarWinds and they may think, well, I don't use that software, so why does it matter to me? But it's more like think through the mindset of the adversary, that they knew that if they penetrated this one site, it's a watering hole attack, right? They penetrate this water hole, all the animals come to drink from that water hole, and then everyone's poisoned. So it's the same kind of thing. If your supply chain is so well known to the entire world, and then if you poison that one piece of the supply chain, you can affect multiple vendors, multiple satellites. That's where I see potential, for adversaries. So
great. I'm going to flip to this question that just came in because it's very specific and it's for a specific person. It's aimed at Aaron. And it's about if a threat or a breach has been reported through the Space ISAC or, to the Space ISAC. Who does Space ISAC alert? Do they call Cybercom? Do they call the Space Force? Do they call other operators? Do you get data from DoD to do that kind of alert? Anyway, what's the reporting? How does that? What happens? Somebody reports there's been an attack. What happens then?
Okay, so in Space ISAC, then we declared our initial operating capability in February of 2021. So that means we have a threat intel sharing platform and we have a member sharing portal. So we have the ability to distribute alerts right away to every person who's in our community, which does include our public sector partners. So really the analysis of where it goes depends on who's submitting and whether or not they're a member of Space ISAC or the source is outside of Space ISAC. Because if it is a member of Space ISAC who has something to report, then we are going to recognize that there's a lot of information they may want redacted. As was pointed out earlier, even just sharing a certain slice of the picture can help other people respond and to head off the same type of attack occurring to their system. So we will distribute the alert to every person who's in every company, every person who's in our ecosystem, which means that they're getting that alert as soon as we have worked with the analyst team to be able to get it out.
Good, thank you for that explanation. That was very, very clear. A couple different audience members have asked this question in a couple of different permutations, so I'm going to try to kind of kludge them all together. And it's about the question of resilience and how resilience is being seen right now, especially in the national security arena, as really important for space systems. And that's kind of a change in direction. And it's disaggregation or the creation of these big, mega constellations, et cetera, is seen as one way. to be very effective against ASATs and to preside, direct to send ASATs or even on orbit ASATs, and even electronic warfare, right? Because you close down one satellite, if you've got 45 of them, okay, you can fill in, you can backfill, right? But is this the same? It's not really obvious that this is the same for cyber vulnerabilities and cyber security. Does this kind of disaggregation, either of satellites or of ground systems, make a difference to the cyber, to the ability to cyber vulnerabilities? Who wants to jump in on that? I hope I articulate.
I can start and throw it out to the panel. I think it was, as Ryan had mentioned this earlier, I think from a cyber perspective, scalability of an attack becomes very attractive when you look at cyber attack against a disaggregated, a large proliferate LEO constellation. Whether it's a supply chain where there's a bad part or a software supply chain interdiction, something like that can affect not just one but all of your satellites. So, by going to disaggregated infrastructure for satellites, we might solve one problem, but now we open up other problems. I think this is at least one of them that you open up by going to this this sort of architecture in the satellite arena. And I'm sure the others will come up with other ideas as well.
Yeah, one thing I was going to add to that conversation is, sure, in principle, in a PowerPoint chart, having disaggregation of a control segment or whatever you're doing is a really good idea. But when we talk about the hesitancy to sometimes upgrade very legacy equipment or certainly penetration tests because we're so worried we might break something, if we've never actually practiced what happens when we fail over to another site, what happens when this site goes down, how quickly can we rebuild the site, stand up the VMs and rebuild the affected site, or we do things like Brandon keeps pointing out, the supply chain stuff where I'm taking a single piece of software and I'm updating it to all of my various sites at the same time without testing it, and without understanding what goes into it. That picture of redundancy may not be reality. So we really have to think about what the single point of failures are, and really think through what an adversary would do to defeat such a system.
So one thing to chime in on that is in the resiliency. So I feel like you do quantity can improve resiliency, right? Quantity of assets against certain attacks. However, as we move towards resiliency, we also need to think about the recoverability aspect and automation. So we're moving towards constellations. We're also moving towards automation and automated response. From a fault management perspective, we also need to get to the automated response from any type of cyber intrusion as well. So I think that's important in the resilience discussion, is building in those capabilities with the integration of the fault management on board the vehicle. That way we can be resilient and at the constellation level. So if there is an infected asset for some reason, somehow, like one asset is infected, we have that the cross-link communication. We can drop that asset out of the constellation and have all that kind of autonomously occurring inside. So it's recoverability at the asset level and recoverability at the constellation level to ensure we have the proper resiliency. So those are the type of things I think we need to be thinking about in the future as we move into these mega constellations, is operating with not the full constellation, as well as self-recoverability, self-healing, and those type of aspects.
I think that's actually really interesting aspect, and it's something you could probably hold a whole panel on, the question of automation and these sort of software-defined systems and how you can upgrade them or change the cybersecurity on them on orbit, which is something you couldn't do in the past. And that's like a forward-looking thing that may actually make some of these cyber problems less difficult to deal with. You catch a vulnerability, you can change it. Whereas right now, there isn't a repairman who can go up with a wrench and repair something on orbit, right? We had a couple of sort of more in-depth questions that came in on penetration testing, and like first of all, why we don't see more penetration testing against simulators, because there are satellite simulators and they are on the ground and they're not as expensive as, doing it, as the real thing, et cetera. So that's the first part. And the second part was actually someone asked about how these tests are devised. Like, how do you build them? How do you build models? How do you figure out the methods? And is there like a difference in doing that for satellite systems than for how you do penetration testing now for systems that are on the ground? Whoever wants to go, just go.
So some of the same concepts that you would use for traditional pen testing would apply here. So it's about threat modeling and attack surface analysis, right? Understanding what the legitimate threat model looks like for a particular spacecraft and being able to perform those tests. So you can do that using traditional means, and you just understanding that the inputs, outputs, and the threat model and how all of this stuff interacts. So what you are seeing though is maybe you could have a correlation. So in the space community, at least on the government side, you do see a big push toward model-based system engineering as kind of a buzzword that's been going around, or digital engineering, that type of thing. So you see the UML and SysML and those type of things, from an architectural standpoint. But you could leverage some of those same principles to go to threat modeling as well, as understanding what the threat attack surface is of the spacecraft from a software perspective, and design those tests. I mean, it's just abuse case testing is what you're looking at. So that's a standard software development approach that's been tried and true for years. It's just translating that to a kind of an embedded electronic perspective, and understanding what the real threat surface looks like and attack surface looks like is what we really need to do. And I think if we start thinking in those means, we can devise the test to be accurate and useful, and then operate those on the digital twins that we've discussed as a first pass would be great.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I can talk real quick about the spacecraft simulator part. So that, in my opinion, that's absolutely part of the solution. But it's not just again, we have to have the whole system. So it's not just, it's a big part of it, but it's not just, okay, here's a spacecraft simulator, go figure out what the vulnerabilities are, because the vulnerabilities are in the entire system as a whole. So, I think we need to understand what the ground system's looking like, including operators, including their software upload procedures, all these things, and kind of like a day in the life, and have active penetration tests against that. And yeah, maybe instead of communicating to the actual satellite, we're taking the actual as-is ground system and communicating to the simulator instead. And I think that's a big part of it. But it can't just be, hey, take the simulator and go do some stuff, because there's lots of things you could do, but that doesn't mean they're practical for a real red team to execute. So you got to think of the system as a whole.
As a sort of a more macro or a little bit back out question, one of the audience members asked about addressing the specific issue of ransomware, which kind of brings us up to current events, because ransomware is a big deal now. As you see the headlines about it, and everyone from hospitals to entire governments being held at ransom. Is this something that you are worried about with satellite systems? Is it something that, have we seen anything like that? Is there something specific that you would have to do in the space segment to prevent that, that's different than what you would have to do on the ground? Anyone?
So on the ground segment, the ransomware would apply similarly, right? There's no real differentiator between what a ransomware attack on the ground would look like versus traditional. But on the space asset, it would be. So it may not even be ransomware from, it's a concept of ransoming is probably what is more likely, right? Is you might not encrypt all the files on the file system on the spacecraft, but you may change the cryptography keys so that you can't command it, right? So you've essentially performed the same action. You've locked out the people who own and operate that vehicle. And I am extremely worried about that as a viable mechanism. So just think about, a commercial company who spends, $100 million launching a satellite for whatever, and then they lose the ability to command it because some adversary hacked into the ground system and stole the encryption keys, and now they've changed them so that you cannot no longer command your vehicle and they say, give me $1 billion or 100 million or whatever it is, to get back your asset. So I think that's a high risk, high reward proposition for ransomware actors to go after. But it wouldn't be, I don't see you necessarily encrypting the file system like you would see, but it would be more the concept of locking you out from accessing your satellite to be able to do the same, achieve the same goal and get the ransom.
In other words, they would control your satellite, not you, and you wouldn't have any control over it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any hope that that people are talking about computing at the edge on satellites, like that you do some of the processing on the satellite itself that you now do on the ground system? Would that help at all?
Well, so I would think some sort of, depending on what type of attack vector you feel like is most likely for you. So potentially secondary out of band communication to retrieve your asset if it were to be taken over would be one logical explanation to circumvent the loss of the cryptography aspect of it. But if you have someone on board the vehicle and doing things, then yeah, there's probably some edge computing that may help in that case. So I think it's what your threat model looks like in your opinion, what's most likely, and what would be the solution for you. But I think both of those could be solutions to the ransoming type of attack.
Yeah, this is what makes this so difficult, because in many ways it's always a case by case basis. It depends on your threat actor, it depends on your satellite, it depends on your system, it depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, so there's so many factors that go into this that I think it makes it really difficult, particularly for policymakers, to figure out what to do. We have 5 minutes left in our session. So what I would like to do is go to each of the panelists to give you like just a minute to say, like, wrap up, or say if I didn't ask a question that you were dying to answer, something you were dying to say, now is the time. So I'm going to go to Erin first. Ladies first, you go.
Okay, I'm going to tag on real quick on the ransomware topic and let everyone know that we are sharing alerts almost every single day, multiple times a day, with good information on how to prepare yourself to respond to ransomware attacks as part of the space sector. And also, I'm very happy to share my contact with anyone who's interested in continuing the discussion, who wants to be more involved in what's going on in this community and raising the security posture for global space. Also, I want to encourage everyone that although some of these topics sounded complex and near impossible, it's not impossible. We are all working every day very hard on this. And there are a lot of people who are taking this very seriously and moving the ball forward.
Excellent. Prashant.
Yeah, I think that, this topic of cyber for space systems, we're talking about because it's really important. And I think that it's the type of topic where if we don't really come together, as a community and really start thinking about that and get ahead of this problem, we're going to run into a problem because we're so dependent upon space systems that we make ourselves as a country that so vulnerable to a disruption to our space systems that it really will affect our our society, our quality of life, or on that day when we get into a conflict that we will not be ready for that conflict. And that's what concerns me, and that's why we're concentrating on this topic. This is one that I think it's really important we get ahead of.
Brandon.
Yeah, I would close out by saying I would like for the community to come along and have basically a minimum standard for security for any type of space asset, starting from the small sat all the way up to your larger constellation type mission. So I feel like it's going to be a sliding scale of what defense in depth principles you can implement based on your mission type and mission profile. But I feel like if the menu of options has been publicized and somewhat validated and accepted across the community, and so that developers and mission planners can know, okay, this is my threat, these are my threats, and these are my kind of defensive options to pick from. I think that would behoove us as a community to getting that education out on the types of security and what types of threats they mitigate is crucial. And we at Aerospace have been doing that, and we'll be publishing more information in the near future on that topic.
All right, last but not least, Ryan, you have the last word.
I'll just say something really brief. I think where we're at today is a product of the way spacecraft have been built for many years, and it's not something that we can just one person can just say, hey, let's do it this way, and all of a sudden everything will just change. I think we need a lot of people kind of steering the ship in one direction, that this is important, and we need to be proactive, not reactive to our threats. And so I think if we can get as many people as possible kind of pushing in that direction, I think we can make some big progress.
Thank you. And you know, that's exactly why events like this are really important, because it allows a conversation in sort of a safe space, if you will, about the problems, about the issues, and helps raise awareness. So I want to thank again our organizers at the Wilson Center and the Aerospace Corporation for putting this together. I want to thank the excellent panel for doing a really great job with a really complex topic. I know we didn't get to all the audience questions, but I encourage you all to go to both the Wilson Center website and to the Aerospace Corporation website, and to follow us at Breaking Defense to learn more about these issues and to stay on top of them. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your evening or your afternoon, wherever you are, and stay safe out there. Okay, bye.